I want to start today with a brief reflection on how certain we are in our knowledge. Okay, this is a Cartesian-inspired reflection. And at the top we might put physics, chemistry. These are considered the hardest of the hard sciences. Biology is considered less hard. Okay. Psychology, less hard still. We can look into the humanities and talk about human morality. Further down, we might find art. Okay, still further down, we might find language itself. I think this is more or less an intuitive kind of a hierarchy. And I want us to explore this hierarchy in light of the question, is truth, that is truth in this particular field of endeavor, academic field of endeavor, something that is invented or discovered? In other words, are humans making up capital T truth in this particular field? Or is it something that they're discovering in this field? Let's start with physics. Okay, so in physics, for example, think about macro level physics, the Newtonian laws, the movement of the heavenly bodies, right? Cosmology, astronomy. Micro level physics, quantum mechanics, the operations of the atom. All across that spectrum, is truth something that is invented or discovered in the field of physics? When physicists arrive at a particular idea about the world, is it something they are inventing or something they are discovering? I think most of us would agree with Tiffany that physics is something where a field of endeavor where truth is being discovered, not made up. At least I'd like to think that that's what humans are doing when they are engaging in a study of the physical world. And maybe that goes for chemistry as well. What about in biology? Think of macro level biology, like ecology, for instance, where we classify forests or wetlands or grasslands, or like micro level biology, where we look at the functions of the cell, cellular organisms, or where we, come on in, Zaire. Yeah, doing well. Or where we look at the operations of bodies. Okay, human anatomy is an example of that. In the field of biology, is truth, capital T truth, something that we are inventing or discovering? In other words, when you read a biology textbook and it says this is the way such and such is that something that's being invented or discovered? Discovered? Okay. I think for much of biology that's the case. I have increasingly come to the view that for some of biology it's invented. Okay, so for instance, for the analysis of cellular organisms, I think that biologists are certainly discovering the way those cellular organisms in fact are. But to take macrobiology like ecology, like I mentioned a minute ago, I think that the classification of trees or forests or wetlands or grasslands or whatever, I think that's kind of arbitrary. It seems to be an invented factoid rather than a discovered factoid. Okay, and very controversial in biology, of course, is evolution as a theory of natural selection. Is this something that is invented or discovered? Invented, everyone says. I think that to some extent there is certainly human input and fictionalizing going on. A story is being told. At the same time, common descent seems to be the way things, at least in my view, again, I'm a theistic evolutionist. Common descent seems to be the way things are. That is, the way things have come to be down through the millennia. Okay, so I think that there is some degree of invention going on in biology, and I would agree with you guys that some degree of discovery is taking place as well. What about in the field of psychology? Can psychology arrive at truths that are about human beings and the operation of human minds that are true as such, or are they rather characterizations of human minds that are invented? In other words, are they discovered truths that are true whether or not you and I like it, or are they rather stories that are told about the operation of the human mind? What do you guys think? Invented? Okay. Is that a general sentiment? Is truth in psychology invented or discovered? Both? Okay. Maybe it depends on the part of psychology we're talking about. Okay. If you look at experimental psychology, for example, let's take classical conditioning as a field of study. I think that the phenomenon of conditioning, right, the famous Pavlovian experiments with the bell and the dog and the meat and stuff, I think the phenomenon of conditioning is probably a discovered truth. I think that that's just kind of the way things are. At the same time, a whole bunch of theories in psychology seem to be just theories and not necessarily representations of fact. It's kind of a just so story that maybe has some bearing on fact, but it's kind of a correspondence bearing. It's not necessarily actually the way the mind is. It's just a story about the way the mind is that bears some resemblance to the actual operations of the mind. What about truth and morality? Is truth and morality something that is invented or discovered? Invented? Invented? Discovered? Is truth and morality. So are there moral truths? Are there moral truths? Are some things true and some things false, morally speaking? Okay, so here it says it's discovered. Okay, I heard a couple of invented. Leda, did you say invented? Okay. Defend your position. That's cool, that's cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, presumably it would be independent of our own opinions about it if it's a discovered truth, right? Okay, that's a big controversy, like these other fields that are softer than hard physics, right? Biology and psychology. Maybe some things in morality are invented and others are discovered. Okay, my own view is that there are truths in morality that are actually universally the case, but there are also other truths in morality that are only culturally the case. In other words, it would be fine for you to do one thing in one culture, but not fine for you to do that in another culture. My mother, I may have told you guys this story before. My mother teaches ESL, and so this means she sometimes is invited over to her students' homes. And these students come from very different cultures than America. And she has some Iranian students. And they invited her over to their home. And she saw this beautiful plate on the wall. Fabulous, fabulous wall ornaments. Okay, clearly a very expensive piece. And she was admiring it, and she said, wow, what a beautiful addition to your living room. This is just gorgeous. At which point, apparently, because they're Iranian and because this is the way their culture works, she then became obligated to take this home with her, and this became hers, which mortified her. This was absolutely mortifying to her. Apparently, in Iran, if you admire an ornament or some other piece in somebody's house, they're obligated to give it to you as a gift. Okay, I think this is a toxic cultural practice. But apparently it is the case. And she was just horrified because it's obviously very expensive. I think that's a cultural truth that is clearly invented, not discovered. I think that that's a culture-specific truth. Okay, I'll use that as an example of that. But others seem to be discovered, like that, prohibitions against theft or against lying. Okay, art. Are truths in art invented or discovered? In other words, we've talked about this from a different angle before when we were talking about Augustine. Are some pieces of, or some concepts in art inherently superior to other concepts? Or is it all just human creation when it comes to standards in art? Is truth in art invented or discovered? Invented? Okay. Okay, I have increasingly come to the view that much of truth in art is invented. Okay, I guess that seeing award ceremonies for art has led me to believe that a lot of it's just political power play. Like the Academy Awards and the Grammys and all that, it just seems to be total political power play, and it doesn't seem like there's actually anything superior about the pieces of art that they're honoring over other pieces of art. At the same time, though, there are concepts of symmetry or of clarity, maybe complexity or accessibility, that make some pieces of art, music, cinema, more maybe better than others. And so perhaps symmetry or complexity or clarity or accessibility or other kinds of similar standards, fecundity, might be principles in art that are discovered rather than invented because so many humans agree upon them. One last field of endeavor, human language. Are truths in language invented or discovered? In other words, I guess you could put it this way. Are there some ways of saying things that are superior to other ways of saying things? Or is it all relative? Most of us would probably be horrified by the thought that English is actually superior, inherently superior to another language. Most of us are probably linguistic relativists, at least about that. Okay, this is an area of controversy as well. Some would argue that part of the reason for the success of some peoples and not of others is the fact that their language, the way they describe the world, the grammatical structures they employ, the range of vocabulary, the way that their words are describing the world or fitting together, the ways they talk about the world are superior. They have invented or encountered, come upon ways of describing the world that are inherently superior. But that's a very controversial thesis to talk about that like that. Okay, I talk about this whole exercise as a way of thinking about the certainty of our knowledge. Again, this is a very Cartesian exercise. How are we to think about the certainty of what we know? Is it something that is going to be around many years from now, decades or centuries perhaps? Okay, and one other question that could be used as an entry point into this exercise is to ask the question from a different point of view. Okay, so these days, the buzzword for a field that everybody wants to claim for themselves is the word science. Okay, if you can call yourself a science, you get funding. If you can call yourself a science, you get cultural prestige. What you are seeking at has some sort of permanence to it, as opposed to being simple opinion, simple invention. If you can call yourself a science, then you're arriving at some sort of a lasting kind of a truth in your endeavors. But let's ask the question for a minute, and I promise you guys we will get into Descartes momentarily. But let's ask the question for a minute. What is a science? What separates a science from something that's not a science. So okay, fact. And a fact is something that is invented, or is it discovered? Discovered, right? Yeah, okay. And so part of the prestige of science is the idea that we are arriving at understandings of the world that are in fact the case. This is the way the world really is. Okay? What else helps qualify something as a science? Any ideas here? Evidence. Okay, so again, something that can be pointed to in the material world that has compelling power. So for instance, this table can serve as evidence in my description right now. If I were to call it the table, suppose I were to call this, I don't know, some random fruit, like a pear or a banana, we obviously would say I'm off my rocker, because the evidence itself compels me to recognize it as a table. The evidence is something that is otherwise than what I am claiming it to be by my expression of my opinion. So that's related to fact, but the idea is that there's something tangible that must be recognized as being the case. Okay, some would point to falsifiability and say, well, look, if a particular theory or point of view can be falsified by pointing to facts and evidence, then that makes this a science. But if you can't falsify a particular point of view by pointing to some independent fact or piece of evidence as being the case, then it must not be a science. Okay, or so the falsifiability advocates would say. So let me ask you guys then, is psychology a science? Let's start in the middle with something controversial. Is psychology a science? Is this a field of endeavor that points to facts, to evidence, and that has statements that can be falsified? Yes? Some aspects of psychology maybe, other aspects no. That's a common position to take on this particular topic. What about another field that we don't have up there on the board? What about, we call it government here at HBU, but in many schools, they call it the political science department. Is this a science? You guys speak up a little bit. Don't think it's a science? Okay. What is it doing then when it's employing the methods of science? You know, the measurements, the surveys, the statistics, the attempt to find hard data to appeal to something and say this is the way things are. What is it doing then when it employs those things? Is it a pseudoscience? Are the claims that are made in the field of political science eternal truths in the sense that physics is? Or are they simply time and place characterizations of the opinions of a certain people group or the way that a particular government operates or something? Probably more like the latter, right, than the former? Yeah? So I think probably most of us would agree that this is not a science in the sense that it could be falsified or appeals to evidence or fact that is true for all time. Maybe it's a field of endeavor that appeals to fact and evidence that are things that are true in a particular time and place, or have localized truth or something. Okay, this is food for thought. Let's go ahead and explore Descartes now. I want us to talk about his notion of clear and distinct ideas. Okay, and this is coming out of Meditations 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so let me erase what we've got on the board here. Okay, for Descartes, what he can trust as true is whatever he can clearly and distinctly perceive. This is what he concludes in Meditation 4. What he can clearly and distinctly perceive is something that is the deliverance of his intellect and that he has spent substantial time accumulating knowledge about. Okay, so if his mind can clearly and distinctly perceive a table as being here in front of him, then it must be the case that there is a table indeed in front of him. But if his mind cannot clearly and distinctly perceive such a thing, then he has no evidence that such a thing in fact exists, could exist, or is even a real thing in any meaningful sense of the word. Yes? Great question. No room for mystery. Terrific, yeah. So if it's something that he cannot clearly and distinctly perceive, at the end of Meditation 4, Descartes concludes that he has to suspend judgment about its existence. So I think that that includes all phenomena that we can't immediately explain using our sensory faculties and our perception operating with our sensory faculties. Okay, so for instance, for sure, psychological phenomena that are bizarre are included in that category. But also, maybe the spirit world would be included in that category, or any other kind of non-explainable stuff in our surroundings. Come on in. Would be included in that category. So yeah, I think that would definitely exclude a lot of things, for sure, without a doubt. Descartes arrives at this clear and distinct conclusion because he thinks that a major reason why he has been unable to arrive at permanent truth in his life and in the course of his life and his accumulation of opinions has been because he has made judgments prior to having full knowledge, and thus prior to being able to clearly and distinctly perceive something as being the case. Okay, let me talk for a minute about this clear and distinct criterion, clear and distinct ideas. One thing that Descartes thinks must be the case is God's existence, because he can clearly and distinctly perceive such a thing as being the case. At least so he thinks. Another thing that Descartes thinks must be the case is his own existence, which he can clearly and distinctly perceive. Still another thing is the existence of the world around him, which he can clearly and distinctly perceive. Less clear and distinct, though, are phenomena of the mind which he cannot clearly and distinctly grasp. Okay, so for instance, he engages in Meditations 4 and 6 in a flight of fancy, where he says, I can clearly and distinctly perceive a three-sided figure. I can clearly and distinctly perceive a five-sided figure. I can't really draw a good one. But I cannot clearly and distinctly perceive a 1,000-sided figure. Right? A chiliagon. At this point, he says, my ability to think breaks down, and I can't clearly and distinctly perceive it. So I'm going to have to suspend judgment about it, about its existence or about its efficacy in the world as a geometrical figure. One thing that, trust me. It means he's agnostic about it. Yeah, to be agnostic about something is to say, well, I don't have enough evidence to know one way or another whether this is the case. And he's agnostic about all things that he can't clearly and distinctly perceive. I've actually got issues with this whole clear and distinct perception idea, which is very influential, but I've got issues with it because I think it boils down to personal intuition. Because I think that different people are going to have different conceptions of what they can clearly and distinctly perceive. It doesn't give us an interpersonal criterion for identifying truth. It's a criterion for identifying truth that is located just within each individual mind. I'm saying he can't say that the clear and distinct criterion yields certain truth. Certain truth, I think, has to be something that people can agree upon across minds, like, a bunch of different minds can agree upon. But what one person clearly and distinctly perceives might be what another doesn't clearly and distinctly perceive. And as such, I guess I would say he's arrived at a nice subjective understanding of truth and what counts as true, but it's not an objective understanding of truth and what counts as truth. Because for it to be objective, it would need to have interpersonal cross-mind efficacy, or interpersonal cross-mind purchase. Okay, let me put an argument for, a very famous argument for mind-body dualism that Descartes makes on the basis of this clear and distinct perception criterion up here on the board. Okay, Descartes, for instance, concludes that the body is distinct from the mind on the basis of a clear and distinct perception argument. This is the bodily distinction argument. Bear with me, this will take me a minute to get up here on the board. It's got a number of premises to it. Okay, God can create anything I can clearly and distinctly perceive. Okay, so God can create clear and distinct things. C and D for clear and distinct. Okay, the second premise, if God creates something to be independent of another, then they are distinct from each other. Okay, if God creates something that is independent, then they are distinct. Might take me a little longer to put on the board than I thought. I might talk some of these premises. God can create, if God creates an independent thing, then it is a distinct thing. That's what he's saying there. Okay. Yeah, the fact of its independence makes it distinct in his mind. Yeah, it's a real subtle argument. It relies upon very subtle, nuanced meanings of words, but it's also a famous Cartesian argument, so I think it's important for us to at least briefly to go over it. So third premise, I clearly and distinctly understand my existence as a thinking thing. So his existence as a thinking thing, we'll call that the cogito. Remember, I think, therefore I am. The cogito is clear and distinct. His existence as a thinking thing that is, he exists because he thinks, is something that he can clearly and distinctly understand. Okay, so premise 4, God therefore can create a thinking thing independently of a body. The cogito is a thinking thing, which is clear and distinct. Okay, independent things that God creates are also distinct. Okay, therefore God can create a distinct thing which is independent of a body. We'll call it D for a distinct thing. I for independence. D for distinct, I for independence. Okay, fifth premise. Thanks for bearing with me and being patient here. I clearly and distinctly understand my body as an extended thing. Okay, so once again, body is clear and distinct, in Descartes' mind at least. He can clearly and distinctly understand that his body is a thing. Therefore, sixth premise, so God can create a body independently of a mind. All right, moving on over here. Thanks for being patient. We're getting to the end of this. So God can create a body, I for independence, that is independent of a mind. Okay, premise 7, so Descartes concludes his mind is really distinct from his body. This will get wild in just a minute. The mind is really distinct from body. D for distinct. Therefore, conclusion. Descartes concludes that as a thinking thing, he can exist without a body. Okay, as a thinking thing, he can exist without a body. That's the wild part at the end. Okay, Descartes, remember, proves his own existence with the cogito. As a thinking thing, Descartes says, therefore, I must be able to exist without a body. And he actually says this in Meditation 6. He says, it is clear that what defines me, the I that defines me, is independent of my body and can exist without it. Okay, this is the bodily distinction argument. God can create clear and distinct things. If God creates things that are independent, then they are distinct. The cogito is clear and distinct. God can create a distinct thing that is independent of the body. The body is clear and distinct. Therefore, God can create a body that is independent of a mind. The mind is really distinct from the body, and therefore Descartes concludes that as a thinking thing, he, namely a mind, can exist without a body. Since distinct things can be created by God that are independent of bodies. This is a really bizarre argument, but it's very famous as an argument for what is called Cartesian dualism.
Especially because you can't create a body that's independent from the mind. Like a body without a mind is just like nothing. Like it doesn't function.
Yeah, I know.
You can see that with people that are vegetables. They don't have any cognitive functions, and they can't.
F is where I get off the train. It's one of the premises where I get off the train. And I tend to side with those who say the afterlife is actually an embodied thing, because I can't it's really hard for me, honestly, to imagine human beings without bodies. We are embodied creatures. That's part of who we are. The Cartesian argument, though, is really influential these days. Here's why it's influential. It's become very influential in the last several decades as the basis for the transgender movement. Right? Because at the heart of the transgender movement is the idea that it's possible for our minds to be so distinct or in dissonance with our bodies that you can have a particular gender mentally that is different than your physical, sex, right? Whatever you are physically. This is like a really Cartesian thought. The idea that the human mind is so distinct from the body that the mind can actually have a different gendered orientation than the body can have. Okay, and you hear these days often the argument made that someone will say that nature assigned me the wrong body. That assumes that the mind is so independent of the body that its real definition, the real I that is the mind, is something distinct from the body and doesn't require the body as part of its definition. It's like a wholly other thing. And so whatever body is then, on this way of seeing things, whatever body is then substituted in, it doesn't really matter. Because it doesn't alter the mind, which is the real I, the real self-conscious being. It's the I that makes up the mind. And the body is just kind of an appendage or a substitutable phenomenon that can be moved in and out at will. Okay, does everybody kind of see the importance of the argument then? Why it's like a big deal? What do you guys think? Are we, is our core definition as human beings, is it our minds? Is it a mind-body composite? Is it possible to separate the two and to conceive of our core definition as being just our minds, like Descartes wants to say? Do we require bodies as part of our definition? I mean, let's open the gender topic for just a minute, if I may. Can people be born in the wrong body? Okay, Zaire, go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, I wasn't going to talk about that.
You weren't going to talk about that? Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to talk about, like how you said, like, without a mind, the body is affected. Is it the other way around? Without a body, the mind is affected? Or, like, not a person, but like...
I don't think the mind can exist without the body. That's my own personal view. My own personal view is that we are inseparable body-soul composites. The human beings have two components, bodies and minds, or bodies and souls, right? And that to separate either one and to say a human is just this or a human is just that is to do something that actually can't be done to a human being.
So I don't know how we got that conclusion if he's never been apart from his body.
Well, it's because he can clearly and distinctly perceive that his mind... that he can clearly and distinctly perceive that the definition of him, the cogito, is a thinking thing, apart from his body. That's what he thinks. That's his opinion, is he can clearly and distinctly perceive a definition of himself that's separate from his body.
So he doesn't think that that's, like, his body is the reason why he can perceive?
No, he doesn't conceive of it that way. He thinks that his body is just this arbitrary phenomenon. And so, as such, if he were alive today, he probably would favor transgender thinking as a way of thinking about this topic, because he thinks that the mind and the body can be so distinct from each other that you can have a mind born in the wrong body or some sort of some sort of psychological phenomenon
I
like
guess
that.
you could think about it with real life examples as like, was it Stephen Hawking, right?
Mhm.
That was like a total vegetable in the body, but he was like still had a really smart mind.
Yeah, but again, let me press on you, Matthew, and you can push back on me if you want. But like, he had to have a body, right?
So he had to communicate his thoughts.
To communicate his thoughts and to sustain his mind with nourishment and to provide his mind with the ability to interact with his surroundings. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like you conclude like, well, I was just born one way, so I mean it's just wrong how it was made. So if you believe that God is perfect, God created everything. But what they say, like what's the conclusion?
Oh, right. If you hold the view that God, as a perfect being, intends to create, people as part of his creation, and these people are the way he intended them to be, then certainly you wouldn't hold that God made a mistake or that people happened to be born differently than they were intended to be. So, yeah, I mean, I guess God intended to be male, intended me to be male, is what I would say.
It'd be hard to try to hold that view, because it's contradictory. You would say, well, God is perfect, but then at the same time, I also think like I can be a female, but I'm in a male body. So it's
Sure.
And usually when you find transgender Christians, they don't have the view that God is perfect. What God makes is automatically perfect. They don't hold that view, and that's why
Right.
they believe in transgender, because they don't believe what God makes is completely perfect.
Right. In some sense, the assumption must be there that a mistake was made at nature, or that some outcome that wasn't intended by God is what resulted, if you are a theist and hold to those views. But let's back up for just a second. All right, so Descartes says the minds are human beings as a thinking thing, are clear and distinct, and therefore this makes his mind independent of his body, and the I, that is the self, can exist without a body. Okay, if the I that is the self, if what makes you truly you, can exist without a body, then the transgender assertion that some people can be born in the wrong body, or that it's possible for us to experience extreme forms of dysphoria where we feel so at odds with our bodies that we need some form of like surgery to correct the wrongness of the arrangement, or some medical arrangements, then that must be the case. Okay. What do we think about that? Do we think that it's possible for people to be born in the wrong body? Do we think that it's possible to have nature make a mistake, as it were, and to give us a body that is at odds with our true selves, the true I that makes you you? What do we think about this issue? This is really controversial, but I thought I'd raise it on. I mean, it is a very Cartesian issue, so. Everyone's looking away. No one's looking at me. I got a couple people looking at me. That's good. Everyone's trying to avoid eye contact with the instructor. Does anybody want to weigh in on this? Do you so I guess let's start with the meta question. Is what makes you you something that is independent of your body? So this is not the transgender question as such. We're not quite there yet. I guess I'm asking if you guys agree with Descartes that the real you is something that's independent of your body.
If you think about it, what makes you you is your experiences. You aren't you until you have your experiences make up you. When you're born, you're not you. You don't have any experiences. I mean, it's not until later on that you're like, okay, this is what makes up Matthew, right?
Right.
This is what makes up Dr. Neal, or because you have those experiences. So I guess it's not really independent because your mind and your body work together.
You couldn't have those experiences without a body?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. All right, so that would lead to the conclusion that what makes you, Matthew or anybody, is actually something that is mind and body. So that would be for a more of a composite view of the human being. Okay? Others?
I guess like kind of thing. I don't think that point. Like because two people can have the exact same experience, but come out totally different. So I feel like there is a part of you that's like our personality. Like people who have different personalities, but they can be raised in the same household. Like it's just yes, you're. I guess it's the way you react to situations that makes you not the way you, not what you go through, it's how you go through.
Okay, all right. I think that that's part of it as well. Yep.
It's just like it's you all alone, but it's like you discovering yourself as time goes on.
Sure.
Because you be like, well, I didn't know this about myself until now. Like it was in you the whole time. You just found out that this is one of the times.
Sure. Okay. And does that require a body, or is that something that can be had independent of a body? It requires a body. Is your view then? So let me just start pressing people then. Oh yeah. Okay. Before we get controversial.
I do hold the belief that the mind is more powerful than the body. Like your mind is definitely more powerful than your body. And this is proven many times over by athletes and the way that you control your body to exceed your limits.
Right. Okay. Sure.
So,
Or the way we conceive of phenomenal machines or technologies that can do far more than we personally as physical beings could do. The machine being a product of the mind, etc. Okay? Yeah, I think that's the case. But that's not controversial. Let's get controversial for just a minute, and I will let us go to break. I just want us to see the impact and the relevance of this famous Cartesian argument. Can you be born in a body that's not you? Can nature make a mistake?
well, there is no such thing as nature.
Okay, or
It's only, so you would say, is God, we would phrase it as God making a mistake.
is God making a mistake? Right. If you're a theist, many these days are not theists, right? And would say nature is what is doing this. Can you be born into a body that's not you? Oh, come on. Can someone speak up on behalf of the transgender view? I don't have anybody who said that yet. Okay, Tiffany says you can. All right, good. I'm glad we've got that view on the table. Can you expand on that just a little bit? If you don't want to, that's okay.
I think that he said like a while back when we were about Tom Brady, and he said like you take Tom Brady that you'll still be Tom Brady because his mom is Tom Brady. I think you can apply that to transgender people as well, even if like their body is not something.
Okay.
It's different because like sex is
Okay, good. Thank you. And that's a common position these days. It's a very Cartesian-style position, or I guess a derivation of Descartes. Descartes himself might not exactly be saying that, but it's a derivation of the Cartesian-style view of what a human being is. Okay, and the view is that, yes, you can be born in the wrong body that is not actually you. That's not actually you. And in order for it to be you, we need to do surgical procedures or take medicines and various other things in order to make it more of an expression of you.
I mean, it's like for even athletes, like gonna change in like roll through your life depending on like how you do it.
I was born in a body that made me 5'11" and unable to dunk. This was a mistake. I should have been 6'8" and as fast and strong as LeBron. This was clearly a mistake on nature's part, or God's part. What's that, Matthew?
It's a whole